Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're tackling a massive age-old question. Is the Bible scientifically credible? How exactly should we view this ancient text today? Some people treat it like a respectful, antiquated museum piece. They think, sure, it's a great literary effort from antiquity, maybe up there with Plato or Shakespeare, but fundamentally, it's completely out of date. Others might say it has a little bit of historical value, but they argue its view of the physical world is just hopelessly out of touch with modern reality. So our goal today is to examine the source material directly. We want to see whether it's truly an obsolete relic or if it's a text that actually harmonizes with scientific realities.
Now, the foundational premise the source explores here is actually pretty logical. It goes like this. If the author of nature and the source of scripture are one and the same, well, those two things should perfectly align. Think about it in terms of math. We definitely don't expect mathematical errors in the text. For example, when Daniel's ancient prophecy segments weeks into 62, 7, and 1, they add up flawlessly to 70. The math is precise. So the question the source material poses is this. If it's accurate in its math, why should we scramble for cover when the text touches on the natural world? If the text is truly harmonious, it should absolutely hold up to scrutiny. Okay, let's dive into this. We're going to look at 4 main scientific arenas today to map out the arguments presented in the source material: the laws of physics, genetics and human origins, solving translation blunders, and finally what we're calling the graveyard of superstition. All right, up first, Section 1, the laws of physics, thermodynamics versus outdated textbooks. Let's get into it. The source kicks things off with a really fascinating contrast. Think about how rapidly modern science textbooks become obsolete, often in just a few years because of new discoveries. A great example is George Gamow's famous 1948 physics book. But on the flip side, the ancient claims of Genesis have remained remarkably static. To see how this plays out, we can look back just a few decades ago when the famous skeptical philosopher Bertrand Russell confidently claimed there is no reason the universe couldn't have just existed forever without a cause. That idea of a static, eternal universe was a hugely dominant secular view, and that perfectly sets up the claim versus reality dynamic that drives this whole analysis. Because here's the reality check from the first law of thermodynamics. Matter and energy cannot create itself. And this perfectly mirrors Genesis chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, which explicitly states that God's creative activity was finished. The text argues that no new matter or energy is being fundamentally created today. Sure, it can change form, like turning from a solid block of ice into a gas, but it absolutely cannot spontaneously create itself. So the ancient text aligns seamlessly with the first law, literally thousands of years before thermodynamics even had a name. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is when we apply the second law of thermodynamics. We know for a fact the universe is running down. It's losing usable energy, kind of like a giant wound-up clock that's slowly losing its momentum. And logically, if it's running down, somebody had to wind it up in the past, right? It means the universe is not eternal. It had a definitive starting point. That aligns exactly with what Moses wrote in Genesis 1:1. The universe had a beginning, which, of course, effectively dismantles Bertrand Russell's skeptical claim. Moving right along to Section 2, genetics and human origins, focusing on this idea of one ancestral stock. Let's explore the historical track record of scientific claims regarding human origins, race, and biology, and see how they stack up against the ancient text. Throughout history, secular thought has often been deeply divided and heavily biased. You had the ancient Athenians claiming they were a special, superior creation, basically looking down on everyone else as mere barbarians. Later on, Charles Darwin's theories were utilized to argue for an evolutionary racial hierarchy, suggesting some groups were just biologically superior to others. And this kind of thinking tragically peaked with the grim reality of the 1940s, where even the U.S. Red Cross was physically segregating human medical blood into different crates based on race during World War II. But contrast those historical, purely human biases with the biblical claim. What did the Apostle Paul actually say to the elite, intellectually proud philosophers of Athens in Acts chapter 17? He declared that God made of one blood all nations of men to dwell on the face of the earth. He stated unequivocally that humanity came out of one single ancestor. No hierarchy, just one blood. And this brilliantly illustrates the source's point. Look at this quote from evolutionary anthropologist Dr. Ashley Montague. All ethnic groups must have originated from a single ancestral stock. The source points out that modern genetics and anthropology completely vindicate the biblical stance of a single human family. Anthropologists now admit that the more we study the human genome, the more alike we turn out to be. So, while the historical human biases of secular science failed pretty miserably, the ancient text proved to be remarkably precise. Okay, on to Section 3, Solving Translation Blunders, Myth versus Reality.
We're pivoting to linguistics here to examine some common translation traps that critics frequently use to mock the text. Let's just walk right through them. Critics love to scream that Genesis promotes a solid vault sky that's physically holding back water. But the historical reality? The original Hebrew word used is rakia, which simply means an open expanse, not a solid ceiling. Then there's the famous mythical unicorn charge, which we'll look at closer in a second, but the Hebrew word reem actually means wild ox. Finally, critics point to the phrase four corners of the earth as undeniable proof of a flat earth belief. But as we're going to see, that is just a super common human figure of speech.
Let's zero in on that unicorn blunder for a moment, because honestly, it's pretty funny when you think about it. Critics point to the old King James Version and laugh at the inclusion of a magical fairy tale creature. But the word reem in the original Hebrew text simply refers to a powerful, massive, and now extinct species of wild ox. It was literally just an inaccurate translation by 17th century scholars. So no, there are no magical horses with spiral horns running around in the original text. And what about the whole flat earth charge? Well, the phrase four corners is just a directional idiom. I mean, even today, the U.S. Marine Corps publishes recruiting brochures proudly stating they have men serving at the four corners of the earth. Nobody honestly thinks the government believes the planet is a literal square. It's just a figure of speech. Meanwhile, if you look at ancient texts like Isaiah 40:22, it accurately describes God sitting above the circle, or the sphere, of the earth.
Which brings us to Section 4, the Graveyard of Superstition, Ancient Medical Textbooks.
Here, we're going to examine how ancient secular medical textbooks compare directly to the laws found in the Bible. And the premise here is absolutely fascinating. Purely human writings almost inevitably absorb the foolish pseudoscience of their specific era. Take the brilliant philosopher Aristotle, for example. He confidently taught that the human brain was just a cold compound of earth and water. Seriously? Or look at the highly respected Egyptian Papyrus Ebers, which was basically the premier medical textbook of the ancient world. Check out one of the top cures from that 16th century BC Papyrus Ebers. If you were suffering from baldness, the leading scientific minds of Egypt prescribed rubbing a mixture of crocodile fat, snake grease, and a crushed donkey tooth, mixed in honey, right onto your head. I am sure that looked wonderful, smelled absolutely fantastic, and did precisely nothing for your hairline. It really highlights the extreme, sometimes toxic superstitions of that time period. So the crucial point the source draws here is this contrast. Moses, the author of the first 5 books of the Bible, was raised in Egypt. He was highly instructed in all the wisdom and medical knowledge of the Egyptians. Yet there is a complete and total absence of those Egyptian superstitions in the Old Testament. He omitted every single one of those absurd, embarrassing remedies from his writings. Instead of prescribing crocodile fat, look at what the Old Testament laws actually contained: highly advanced sanitation and quarantine protocols. These texts detailed specific, clean, sterile instructions for washing, isolating the sick, and handling disease. The text accurately presupposed the existence of microscopic germs thousands of years before the microscope was even invented. That is a real game changer. And that brings us to our conclusion: harmonizing the text. So, as we wrap up this explainer, the source constructs a really powerful defense. The argument isn't that the Bible was written specifically to be a science textbook. Rather, the claim is that whenever the text does touch on the physical, natural world, whether it's physics, genetics, linguistics, or medicine, its precision is absolute. It completely bypasses the scientific pitfalls of its contemporaries, which leaves us with a deeply provocative final question to ponder. Moses wrote perfectly sterile, advanced sanitation laws, accurately dealing with unseen germs thousands of years before microscopes even existed. So how do you explain that? Thanks for diving into this explainer with us today, and I hope it leaves you with something profound to think about.